Chapter 34 of Mrs. Craddock by William Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. But if the human soul, or the heart, or the mind, call it what you will, is an instrument upon which countless melodies may be played, it is capable of responding for very long to no single one. Time dulls the most exquisite emotions, softens the most heart-rending grief. The story is old of the philosopher who sought to console a woman in distress by the account of tribulations akin to hers, and upon losing his only son, was sent by her a list of all kings similarly bereaved. He read it, acknowledged its correctness, but wept none the less. 3 months later the philosopher and the lady were surprised to find one another quite gay, and erected a fine monument to Time with the inscription "À celui qui console." When Bertha vowed that life had lost all savor, that her ennui was unending, she exaggerated as usual, and almost grew angry on discovering that existence could be more supportable than she supposed. One gets used to all things. It is only very misanthropic persons who pretend that they cannot accustom themselves to the stupidity of their fellows. For after a while one gets hardened to the most desperate bores, and monotony even ceases to be quite monotonous. Accommodating herself to circumstances, Bertha found life less tedious. It was a calm river, and presently she came to the conclusion that it ran more easily without the cascades and waterfalls, the eddies, whirlpools, and rocks which had disturbed its course. The man who can still dupe himself with illusions has a future not lacking in brightness. The summer brought a certain variety, and Bertha found amusement in things which before had never interested her. She went to sheltered parts to see if favorite wildflowers had begun to blow. Her love of liberty made her prefer the hedge roses to the pompous blooms of the garden, the buttercups and daisies of the field to the prim geranium and the calceolaria. Time fled, and she was surprised to find the year pass imperceptibly. She began to read with greater zest, and in her favorite seat, on the sofa by the window, spent long hours of pleasure. She read as fancy prompted her, without a plan, because she wished, and not because she ought. How can they say that England is decadent when its young ladies are so strenuous? She obtained pleasure by contrasting different writers, gaining emotions from the gravity of one and the frivolity of the next. She went from the latest novel to the Orlando Furioso, from the Euphues of John Lyly, most entertaining and whimsical of books, to the passionate corruption of Verlaine. With a lifetime before her, the length of books was no hindrance, and she started boldly upon the 8 volumes of the Decline and Fall, upon the many tomes of Saint-Simon, and she never hesitated to put them aside after 100 pages. Bertha found reality tolerable when it was merely a background, a foil to the fantastic happenings of old books. She looked at the green trees, and the song of birds mingled agreeably with her thoughts, still occupied, perhaps, with the dolorous night of La Mancha, with Manon Lescaut, or with the joyous band that wanders through the Decameron. With greater knowledge came greater curiosity, and she forsook the broad highroads of literature for the mountain pathways of some obscure poet, for the bridle tracks of the Spanish picaroon. She found unexpected satisfaction in the half-forgotten masterpieces of the past, in poets not quite divine whom fashion had left on one side, in the playwrights and novelists and essayists whose remembrance lives only with the bookworm. It is a relief sometimes to look away from the bright sun of perfect achievement, and the writers who appealed to their age and not to posterity have by contrast a subtle charm. Undazzled by their splendor, one may discern more easily their individualities and the spirit of their time. They have pleasant qualities not always found among their betters, and there is even a certain pathos in their incomplete success. In music also Bertha developed a taste for the half-known, the half-archaic. It suited the Georgian drawing-room, with its old pictures, with its Chippendale and chintz, to play the simple melodies of Couperin and Rameau, the rondos, the gavottes, the sonatinas in powder and patch, which delighted the rococo lords and ladies of a past century. Living away from the present, in an artificial paradise, Bertha was almost completely happy. She found indifference to the whole world a trusty armor. Life was easy without love or hate, hope or despair, without ambition, desire of change, or tumultuous passion. So bloom the flowers, unconscious, uncaring. The bud bursts from the enclosing leaf and opens to the sunshine, squanders its perfume to the breeze, and there is none to see its beauty, and then it dies. Bertha found it possible to look back upon the past years with something like amusement. It seemed now melodramatic to have loved the simple Edward with such violence, and she was able even to smile at the contrast between her vivid expectations and the flat reality. Gerald was a pleasantly sentimental memory. She did not wish to see him again, but thought of him often, idealizing him till he became unsubstantial as a character in a favorite book. Her winter in Italy also formed the motive of some of her most delightful thoughts, and she determined never to spoil the impression by another visit. She had advanced a good deal in the art of life when she realized that pleasure came by surprise, that happiness was a spirit which descended unawares, and seldom when it was sought. Edward had fallen into a life of such activity that his time was entirely taken up. He had added largely to the Ley estate, and, with the second-rate man's belief that you must do a thing yourself to have it well done, kept the farms under his immediate supervision. He was an important member of all the rural bodies. He was on the school board, on the board of guardians, on the county council. He was chairman of the urban district council, president of the Leanham Cricket Club, president of the Faversley Football Club, patron of the Blackstable Regatta. He was on the committee of the Tercanbury Dog Show, and an enthusiastic supporter of the Mid-Kent Agricultural Exhibition. He was a pillar of the Blackstable Conservative Association, a magistrate, and a churchwarden. Finally, he was an ardent Freemason, and flew over Kent to attend the meetings of the half-dozen lodges of which he was a member. But the amount of work did not disturb him. "Lord bless you," he said, "I love work. You can't give me too much. If there's anything to be done, come to me, and I'll do it, and say thank you for giving me the chance." Edward had always been even-tempered, but now his good nature was quite angelic. It became a byword. His success was according to his deserts, and to have him concerned in a matter was an excellent insurance. He was always jovial and gay, contented with himself and with the world at large. He was a model squire, landlord, farmer, conservative man, Englishman. He did everything thoroughly, and his energy was such that he made a point of putting into every concern twice as much work as it really needed. He was busy from morning till night, as a rule quite unnecessarily, and he gloried in it. "It shows I'm an excellent woman," said Bertha to Miss Glover, "to support his virtues with equanimity." "My dear, I think you ought to be very proud and happy. He's an example to the whole country. If he were my husband, I should be grateful to God." "I have much to be thankful for," murmured Bertha. Since he let her go her own way, and she was only too pleased that he should go his, there was really no possibility of difference, and Edward, wise man, came to the conclusion that he had effectually tamed his wife. He thought, with good-humoured scorn, that he had been quite right when he likened women to chickens, animals which, to be happy, required no more than a good run, well fenced in, where they could scratch about to their heart's content. Feed 'em regularly and let 'em cackle, and there you are. It is always satisfactory when experience verifies the hypothesis of your youth. One year, remembering by accident their wedding day, Edward gave his wife a bracelet, and feeling benevolent in consequence, and having dined well, he patted her hand and remarked, "Time does fly, doesn't it?" "I have heard people say so," she replied, smiling. "Well, who'd have thought we'd been married 8 years? It doesn't seem above 18 months to me. And we've got on very well, haven't we?" "My dear Edward, you are such a model husband. It quite embarrasses me sometimes." "Ha, ha, that's a good one. But I can say this for myself. I do try to do my duty. Of course, at first we had our little tiffs. People have to get used to one another, and one can't expect to have all plain sailing just at once. But for years now, well, ever since you went to Italy, I think, we've been as happy as the day is long, haven't we?" "Yes, dear." "When I look back at the little rumpuses we used to have, upon my word, I wonder what they were all about." "So do I." And this Bertha said quite truthfully. "I suppose it was just the weather." "I dare say." "Ah, well, all's well that ends well." "My dear Edward, you're a philosopher." "I don't know about that, but I think I'm a politician, which reminds me that I've not read about the new men of war in today's paper. What I've been agitating about for years is more ships and more guns. I'm glad to see the government have taken my advice at last." "It's very satisfactory, isn't it? It will encourage you to persevere. And of course it's nice to know that the Cabinet read your speeches in the Blackstable Times." "I think it would be a good sight better for the country if those in power paid more attention to provincial opinion. It's men like me who really know the feeling of the nation. You might get me the paper, will you? It's in the dining room." It seemed quite natural to Edward that Bertha should wait upon him. It was the duty of a wife. She handed him the Standard, and he began to read. He yawned once or twice. "Lord, I am sleepy." Presently he could not keep his eyes open. The paper dropped from his hand, and he sank back in his chair with legs outstretched, his hands resting comfortably on his stomach. His head lolled to one side, and his jaw dropped, and he began to snore. Bertha read. After a while he woke with a start. "Bless me, I do believe I've been asleep," he cried. "Well, I'm dead tired. I think I shall go to bed. I suppose you won't come up yet?" "Not just yet." "Well, don't stay up too late. There's a good girl. It's not good for you. And put the lights out properly when you come." She turned to him her cheek, which he kissed, stifling a yawn. Then he rolled upstairs. "There's one advantage in Edward," murmured Bertha. "No one could accuse him of being uxorious. Mariage à la mode." Bertha's solitary walk was to the sea. The shore between Blackstable and the Medway was extraordinarily wild. At distant intervals were the long, low buildings of the coastguard stations, and the clean, pink walls, the neat railings, the well-kept gravel, contrasted rather surprisingly with the surrounding desolation. One could walk for miles without meeting a soul, and the country spread out from the sea, low and flat and marshy. The beach was of countless shells of every possible variety, which crumbled underfoot, while here and there were great banks of seaweed and bits of wood or rope, the jetsam of 1,000 tides. In one spot, a few yards out, but high and dry at low water, were the remains of an old hulk, whose wooden ribs stood out weirdly like the skeleton of some huge sea beast. And then all round was the lonely sea, with never a ship nor a fishing smack in sight. In winter it was as if a spirit of solitude, like a mystic shroud, had descended upon the shore and upon the desert waters. Then, in the melancholy, in the dreariness, Bertha found a subtle fascination. The sky was a threatening heavy cloud, low down, and the wind tore along shouting, screaming and whistling. There was panic in the turbulent sea, murky and yellow, and the waves leaped up, one at the other's heels, and beat down on the beach with an angry roar. It was desolate, desolate. The sea was so merciless that the very sight appalled one. It was a wrathful power, beating forwards, ever wrathfully beating forwards, roaring with pain when the chains that bound it wrenched it back. And after each desperate effort it shrank with a yell of anguish. And the seagulls swayed above the waves in their melancholy flight, rising and falling with the wind. Bertha loved also the calm of winter, when the sea mist and the mist of heaven were one, when the sea was silent and heavy, and the solitary gull flew screeching over the grey waters, screeching mournfully. She loved the calm of summer, when the sky was cloudless and infinite. Then she spent long hours lying at the water's edge, delighted with the solitude and with her absolute peace. The sea, placid as a lake, unmoved by the lightest ripple, was a looking-glass reflecting the glory of heaven, and it turned to fire when the sun sank in the west. It was a sea of molten copper, red, brilliant, so that the eyes were dazzled. A troop of seagulls slept on the water, and there were hundreds of them, motionless and silent. One arose now and then, and flew for a moment with heavy wing, and sank down, and all was still. Once the coolness was so tempting that Bertha could not resist it. Timidly, rapidly, she slipped off her clothes, and looking round to see that there was really no one in sight, stepped in. The wavelets about her feet made her shiver a little, and then with a splash, stretching out her arms, she ran forward, and half fell, half dived into the water. Now it was delightful. She rejoiced in the freedom of her limbs, for it was an unknown pleasure to swim unhampered by costume It gave a fine sense of power, and the salt water lapping round her was wonderfully exhilarating. She wanted to sing aloud in the joy of her heart. Diving below the surface, she came up with a shake of the head and a little cry of delight. Then her hair was loosened, and with a motion it all came tumbling about her shoulders and trailed out in its ringlets over the water. She swam out, a fearless swimmer, and it gave her a feeling of strength and independence to have the deep waters all about her, the deep, calm sea of summer. She turned on her back and floated, trying to look the sun in the face. The sea glimmered with the sunbeams and the sky was dazzling. Then returning, Bertha floated again, quite near the shore. It amused her to lie on her back, rocked by the tiny waves, and to sink her ears so that she could hear the shingle rub together curiously with the ebb and flow of the tide. She shook out her long hair, and it stretched about her like an aureole. She exulted in her youth. In her youth, Bertha felt no older than when she was 18, and yet she was 30. The thought made her wince, for she had never realized the passage of the years. She had never imagined that her youth was waning. Did people think her already old? The sickening fear came to her that she resembled Miss Hancock, attempting by archness and by an assumption of frivolity to persuade her neighbors that she was juvenile. Bertha asked herself whether she was ridiculous when she rolled in the water like a young girl. You cannot act the mermaid, with crow's feet about your eyes, with wrinkles round your mouth. In a panic she dressed herself, and going home, flew to a looking-glass. She scrutinized her features as she had never done before, searching anxiously for the sign she feared to see. She looked at her neck and at her eyes. Her skin was as smooth as ever, her teeth as perfect. She gave a sigh of relief. "I see no difference." Then, doubly to reassure herself, a fantastic idea seized Bertha to dress as though she were going to a great ball. She wished to see herself to all advantage. She chose the most splendid gown she had, and took out her jewels. The Leys had sold every vestige of their old magnificence, but their diamonds, with characteristic obstinacy, they had invariably declined to part with, and they lay aside year after year unused, the stones in their old settings, dulled with dust and neglect. The moisture still in Bertha's hair was an excuse to do it capriciously, and she placed in it the beautiful tiara which her grandmother had worn in the Regency. On her shoulders she wore two ornaments exquisitely set in gold work, purloined by a great-uncle in the Peninsular War from the saint of a Spanish church. She slipped a string of pearls round her neck, bracelets on her arms, and fastened a glistening row of stars to her bosom. Knowing she had beautiful hands, Bertha disdained to wear rings, but now she covered her fingers with diamonds and emeralds and sapphires. Finally she stood before the looking-glass and gave a laugh of pleasure. She was not old yet. But when she sailed into the drawing-room, Edward jumped up in surprise.
"Good Lord!" he cried. "What on earth's up? Have we got people coming to dinner?"
"My dear, if we had I should not have dressed like this."
"You got up as if the Prince of Wales were coming, and I'm only in knickerbockers. It's not a wedding day."
"No."
"Then I should like to know why you've dressed yourself up like that."
"I thought it would please you," she said, smiling.
"I wish you'd told me. I'd have dressed too. Are you sure no one's coming?"
"Quite sure."
"Well, I think I ought to dress. It would look so queer if someone turned up."
"If any one does, I promise you I'll fly." They went into dinner, Edward, feeling very uncomfortable and keeping his ear alert for the front door bell. They ate their soup, and then were set on the table the remains of a cold leg of mutton and mashed potatoes. Bertha looked for a moment blankly, and then, leaning back, burst into peal upon peal of laughter.
"Good Lord, what's the matter now?"
asked Edward. Nothing is more annoying than to have people violently hilarious over a joke that you cannot see. Bertha held her sides and tried to speak. "I've just remembered that I told the servants they might go out tonight. There's a circus at Blackstable, and I said we'd just eat up the odds and ends."
"I don't see any joke in that."
And really there was none, but Bertha laughed again immoderately.
"I suppose there are some pickles,"
said Edward. Bertha repressed her gaiety and began to eat. "That is my whole life," she murmured under her breath, "to eat cold mutton and mashed potatoes in a ball dress and all my diamonds." End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Mrs. Craddock by William Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. But in the winter of that very year, Edward, while hunting, had an accident. For years he had made a practice of riding unmanageable horses, and he never heard of a vicious beast without wishing to try it. He knew that he was a fine rider, and since he was never shy of parading his powers, nor loath to taunt others on the score of inferior skill or courage, he preferred difficult animals. It gratified him to see people point to him and say, "There's a good rider," and his best joke with some person on a horse that pulled or refused was to cry, "You don't seem friends with your gee. Would you like to try mine?" And then, touching its sides with his spurs, he set it prancing. He was merciless with the cautious hunters who looked for low parts of a hedge, or tried to get through a gate instead of over it. And when any one said a jump was dangerous, Edward, with a laugh, promptly went for it, shouting as he did so, "I wouldn't try it if I were you. You might fall off." He had just bought a roan for a mere song, because it jumped uncertainly, and had a trick of swinging a foreleg as it rose. He took it out on the earliest opportunity, and the first two hedges and a ditch the horse cleared easily. Edward thought that once again he had got for almost nothing a hunter that merely wanted riding properly to behave like a lamb. They rode on, and came to a post and rail fence.
"Now, my beauty, this'll show what you're made of."
He took the horse up in a canter and pressed his legs. The horse did not rise, but swerved round suddenly.
"No, you don't,"
said Edward, taking him back. He dug his spurs in, and the horse cantered up and refused again. This time Edward grew angry. Arthur Branderton came flying by, and having many old scores to pay, laughed loudly. "Why don't you get down and walk over?" he shouted, as he passed Edward and took the jump.
"I'll either get over or break my neck,"
said Edward, setting his teeth. But he did neither. He set the roan at the jump for the fourth time, hitting him with his crop. The beast rose, and then, letting the forelegs swing, came down with a crash. Edward fell heavily, and for a minute was stunned. When he recovered consciousness, he found someone pouring brandy down his neck.
"Is the horse hurt?"
he asked, not thinking of himself. "No, he's all right. How do you feel?" A young surgeon was in the field and rode up. "What's the matter? Anyone injured?"
"No,"
said Edward, struggling to his feet, somewhat annoyed at the exhibition he thought he was making of himself.
One would think none of you fellows had ever seen a man come down before. I've seen most of you come off often enough." He walked up to the horse and put his foot in the stirrup. "You'd better go home, Craddock," said the surgeon. "I expect you're a bit shaken up." "Go home be damned! Confound!"
As he tried to mount, Edward felt a pain at the top of his chest.
"I believe I've broken something."
The surgeon went up and helped him off with his coat. He twisted Edward's arm. "Does that hurt?"
"A bit."
"You've broken your collarbone," said the surgeon, after a moment's examination.
"I thought I'd smashed something. How long will it take to mend?"
"Only 3 weeks. You needn't be alarmed."
"I'm not alarmed, but I suppose I shall have to give up hunting for at least a month."
Edward was driven to Dr. Ramsay, who bandaged him and sent him back to Court Leys. Bertha was surprised to see him in a dog cart. Edward by now had recovered his good temper, and explained the occurrence, laughing.
"It's nothing to make a fuss about, only I'm bandaged up so that I feel like a mummy, and I don't know how I'm going to get a bath. That's what worries me."
Next day Arthur Branderton came to see him. "You've found your match at last, Craddock."
"Me? Not much. I shall be all right in a month, and then out I go again."
"I wouldn't ride him again, if I were you. It's not worth it. With that trick of his of swinging his leg, you'll break your neck."
"Bah!" said Edward scornfully. "The horse hasn't been built that I can't ride."
"You're a good weight now, and your bones aren't as supple as when you were 20. The next fall you have will be a bad one."
"Rot, man. One would think I was 80. I've never funked a horse yet, and I'm not going to begin now."
Branderton shrugged his shoulders and said nothing more at the time, but afterwards spoke to Bertha privately. "You know, I think if I were you, I'd persuade Edward to get rid of that horse. I don't think he ought to ride it again. It's not safe. However well he rides, it won't save him if the beast has got a bad trick." Bertha had, in this particular, great faith in her husband's skill. Whatever he could not do, he was certainly one of the finest riders in the county, but she spoke to him notwithstanding.
"Pooh, that's all rot," he said. "I tell you what, on the 11th of next month we go over pretty well the same ground, and I'm going out, and I swear he's going over that post and rail in Coulter's Field."
"You're very incautious."
"No, I'm not. I know exactly what a horse can do, and I know that horse can jump if he wants to, and by George, I'll make him. Why, if I funked it now, I could never ride again. When a chap gets to be near 40 and has a bad fall, the only thing is to go for it again at once, or he'll lose his nerve and never get it back. I've seen that over and over again." Miss Glover, later on, when Edward's bandages were removed and he was fairly well, begged Bertha to use her influence with him.
"I've heard he's a most dangerous horse, Bertha. I think it would be madness for Edward to ride him."
"I've begged him to sell it, but he merely laughs at me," said Bertha. "He's extremely obstinate, and I have very little power over him."
"Aren't you dreadfully frightened?"
Bertha laughed. "No, I'm really not. You know, he always has ridden dangerous horses, and he's never come to any harm. When we were first married I used to go through agonies. Every time he hunted I used to think he'd be brought home dead on a stretcher, but he never was, and I calmed down by degrees."
"I wonder you could."
"My dear, no one can keep on being frightfully agitated for 10 years. People who live on volcanoes forget all about it, and you'd soon get used to sitting on barrels of gunpowder if you had no armchair."
"Never,"
said Miss Glover, with conviction, seeing a vivid picture of herself in such a position. Miss Glover was unaltered. Time passed over her head powerlessly. She still looked anything between 25 and 40. Her hair was no more washed out. Her figure in its armour of black cloth was as juvenile as ever, and not a new idea nor a thought had entered her mind. She was like Alice's queen, who ran at the top of her speed and remained in the same place. But with Miss Glover the process was reversed. The world moved on, apparently faster and faster as the century drew near its end, but she remained fixed, an incarnation of the 1880s. The day before the 11th arrived. The hounds were to meet at the Share and Coulter, as when Edward had been thrown. He sent for Dr. Ramsay to assure Bertha that he was quite fit, and after the examination brought him into the drawing-room.
"Dr. Ramsay says my collarbone is stronger than ever, but I don't think he ought to ride the roan notwithstanding. Can't you persuade Edward not to, Bertha?"
Bertha looked from the doctor to Edward, smiling. "I've done my best."
"Bertha knows better than to bother," said Edward. "She don't think much of me as a churchwarden, but when a horse is concerned, she does trust me. Don't you, dear?"
"I really do."
"There," said Edward, much pleased. "That's what I call a good wife."
Next day the horse was brought round, and Bertha filled Edward's flask.
"You'll bury me nicely if I break my neck, won't you?" he said, laughing. "You'll order a handsome tombstone?"
"My dear, you'll never come to a violent end. I feel certain you will die in your bed when you're 102, with a crowd of descendants weeping round you. You're just that sort of man."
"Ha ha!" he laughed. "I don't know where the descendants are coming in."
"I have a presentiment that I am doomed to make way for Fanny Glover. I'm sure there is a fatality about it. I've felt for years that you will eventually marry her, and it's horrid of me to have kept you waiting so long, especially as she pines for you, poor thing."
Edward laughed again. "Well, good-bye."
"Good-bye. Remember me to Mrs. Arthur." She stood at the window to see him mount, and as he flourished his crop at her, she waved her hand. The winter day closed in, and Bertha, interested in the novel she was reading, was surprised to hear the clock strike 5. She wondered that Edward had not yet come in, and ringing for tea and the lamps, had the curtains drawn. He could not now be long. "I wonder if he's had another fall," she said with a smile. "He really ought to give up hunting. He's getting too fat." She decided to wait no longer, but poured out her tea and arranged herself so that she could get at the scones and see comfortably to read. Then she heard a carriage drive up. Who could it be? What bores these people are to call at this time! As the bell was rung, Bertha put down her book to receive the visitor, but no one was shown in. There was a confused sound of voices without. Could something have happened to Edward after all? She sprang to her feet and walked half across the room. She heard an unknown voice in the hall. "Where shall we take it?" It. What was it? A corpse? Bertha felt a coldness travel through all her body. She put her hand on a chair, so that she might steady herself if she felt faint. The door was opened slowly by Arthur Branderton, and he closed it quickly behind him. "I'm awfully sorry, but there's been an accident. Edward is rather hurt." She looked at him, growing pale, but found nothing to answer. "You must nerve yourself, Bertha. I'm afraid he's very bad. You'd better sit down." He hesitated, and she turned to him with sudden anger. "If he's dead, why don't you tell me?" "I'm awfully sorry. We did all we could. He fell at the same post and rail fence as the other day. I think he must have lost his nerve. I was close by him. I saw him rush at it blindly, and then pull just as the horse was rising. They came down with a crash." "Is he dead?" "Yes." Bertha did not feel faint. She was a little horrified at the clearness with which she was able to understand Arthur Branderton. She seemed to feel nothing at all. The young man looked at her as if he expected that she would weep or swoon. "Would you like me to send my wife to you?" "No, thanks." Bertha understood quite well that her husband was dead, but the news seemed to make no impression upon her. She heard it unmoved, as though it referred to a stranger. She found herself wondering what young Branderton thought of her unconcern. "Won't you sit down?" he said, taking her arm and leading her to a chair. "Shall I get you some brandy?" "I'm all right, thanks. You need not trouble about me. Where is he?" "I told them to take him upstairs. Shall I send Ramsay's assistant to you? He's here." "No," she said in a low voice. "I want nothing. Have they taken him up already?" "Yes, but I don't think you ought to go to him. It will upset you dreadfully." "I'll go to my room. Do you mind if I leave you? I should prefer to be alone." Branderton held the door open and Bertha walked out, her face very pale, but showing not the least trace of emotion. Branderton walked to Leanham Vicarage to send Miss Glover to Court Leys, and then home, where he told his wife that the wretched widow was stunned by the shock. Bertha locked herself in her room. She heard the hum of voices in the house. Dr. Ramsay came to her door, but she refused to open. Then all was quite still. She was aghast at the blankness of her heart. The tranquillity was so inhuman that she wondered if she was going mad. She felt no emotion whatever. Bertha repeated to herself that Edward was killed. He was lying quite near at hand, dead, and she felt no grief. She remembered her anguish years before when she thought of his death, and now that it had taken place she did not faint, she did not weep, she was untroubled. Bertha had hidden herself to conceal her tears from strange eyes, and the tears came not. After her sudden suspicion was confirmed, she had experienced no emotion whatever. She was horrified that the tragic death affected her so little. She walked to the window and looked out, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to make herself care, but she was almost indifferent. "I must be frightfully cruel," she muttered. Then the idea came of what her friends would say when they saw her calm self-possession. She tried to weep, but her eyes remained dry. There was a knock at the door, and Miss Glover's voice, broken with tears. "Bertha, Bertha, won't you let me in? It's me, Fanny." Bertha sprang to her feet, but did not answer. Miss Glover called again, and her voice was choked with sobs. Why could Fanny Glover weep for Edward's death, who was a stranger, when she, Bertha, remained insensible? "Bertha!" "Yes." "Open the door for me. Oh, I'm so sorry for you. Please let me in." Bertha looked wildly at the door. She dared not let Miss Glover come. "I can see no one now," she cried hoarsely. "Don't ask me." "I think I could comfort you. I want to be alone." Miss Glover was silent for a minute, crying audibly. "Shall I wait downstairs? You can ring if you want me. Perhaps you'll see me later." Bertha wished to tell her to go away, but dared not. "Do as you like," she said. There was silence again, an unearthly silence more trying than hideous din. It was a silence that tightened the nerves and made them horribly sensitive. One dared not breathe for fear of breaking it. And one thought came to Bertha, assailing her like a devil tormenting. She cried out in horror, for this was more odious than anything. It was simply intolerable. She threw herself on her bed and buried her face in her pillow to drive it away. For shame, she put her hands to her ears, so as not to hear the invisible fiends that whispered it silently. She was free. She quailed before the thought, but could not crush it. "Has it come to this?" she murmured. And then came back the recollection of the beginnings of her love. She recalled the passion that had thrown her blindly into Edward's arms, her bitter humiliation when she realized that he could not respond to her ardour. Her love was a fire playing ineffectually upon a rock of basalt. She recalled the hatred which followed the disillusion, and finally the indifference. It was the same indifference that chilled her heart now. Her life seemed all wasted when she compared her mad desire for happiness with the misery she had actually endured. Bertha's many hopes stood out like phantoms, and she looked at them despairingly. She had expected so much and secured so little. She felt a terrible pain at her heart as she considered all she had gone through. Her strength fell away, and overcome by her own self-pity, she sank to her knees and burst into tears.
"Oh, God," she cried, "what have I done that I should have been so unhappy?"
She sobbed aloud, not caring to restrain her grief. Miss Glover, good soul, was waiting outside the room in case Bertha wanted her, crying silently. She knocked again when she heard the impetuous sobs within.
"Oh, Bertha, do let me in. You're tormenting yourself so much more because you won't see anybody."
Bertha dragged herself to her feet and undid the door. Miss Glover entered, and throwing off all reserve in her overwhelming sympathy, clasped Bertha to her heart.
"Oh, my dear, it's utterly dreadful. I'm so sorry for you. I don't know what to say. I can only pray."
Bertha sobbed unrestrainedly.
"Not because Edward was dead. All you have now is God,"
said Miss Glover. At last Bertha tore herself away and dried her eyes.
"Don't try to be too brave, Bertha,"
compassionately said the vicar's sister.
"It will do you good to cry. He was such a good, kind man, and he loved you so devotedly."
Bertha looked at her in silence.
"I must be horribly cruel," she thought. "Do you mind if I stay here to-night, dear?"
added Miss Glover.
"I've sent word to Charles." "Oh, no, please don't. If you care for me, Fanny, let me be alone. I don't want to be unkind, but I can't bear to see any one."
Miss Glover was deeply pained.
"I don't want to be in the way. If you really wish me to go, I'll go. I feel if I can't be alone, I shall go mad." "Would you like to see Charles?" "No, dear. Don't be angry. Don't think me
Chapter 36 of Mrs. Craddock by William Somerset Maugham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. Alone in her room once more, memories of the past crowded upon her. The last years fled from her mind, and Bertha saw vividly again the first days of her love, the visit to Edward at his farm, the night at the gate of Court Leys, when he asked her to marry him. She recalled the rapture with which she had flung herself into his arms. Forgetting the real Edward who had just died, she remembered the tall, strong youth who had made her faint with love, and her passion returned, overwhelming. On the chimney-piece stood a photograph of Edward as he was then. It had been before her for years, but she had never noticed it. She took it and pressed it to her heart and kissed it. 1,000 things came back, and she saw him again standing before her as he was, manly, strong, so that she felt his love a protection against all the world. But what was the use now?
I should be mad if I began to love him again when it is too late.
Bertha was appalled by the regret which she felt rising within her, a devil that wrung her heart in an iron grip. Oh, she could not risk the possibility of grief. She had suffered too much, and she must kill in herself the springs of pain. She dared not leave things which in future years might be the foundations of a new idolatry. Her only chance of peace was to destroy everything that might recall him. She seized the photograph and, without daring to look again, withdrew it from the frame and rapidly tore it in pieces. She looked round the room. "I mustn't leave anything," she muttered. She saw on a table an album containing pictures of Edward at all ages: the child with long curls, the urchin in knickerbockers, the schoolboy, the lover of her heart. She had persuaded him to be photographed in London during their honeymoon, and he was there in half a dozen different positions. Bertha thought her heart would break as she destroyed them one by one, and it needed all the strength she had to prevent her from covering them with passionate kisses. Her fingers ached with the tearing, but in a little while they were all in fragments in the fireplace. Then desperately she added the letters Edward had written to her, and applied a match. She watched them curl and frizzle and burn, and presently they were ashes. She sank on a chair, exhausted by the effort, but quickly roused herself. She drank some water, nerving herself for a more terrible ordeal, for she knew that on the next few hours depended her future peace. By now the night was late, a stormy night with the wind howling through the leafless trees. Bertha started when it beat against the windows, with a scream that was nearly human. A fear seized her of what she was about to do, but she was driven by a greater fear. She took a candle, and opening the door, listened. There was no one. The wind roared with its long, monotonous voice, and the branches of a tree beating against a window in the passage gave a ghastly tap, tap, as if unseen spirits were near. The living, in the presence of death, feel that the whole air is full of something new and terrible. A greater sensitiveness perceives an inexplicable feeling of something present, or of some horrible thing happening invisibly. Bertha walked to her husband's room, and for a while dared not enter. At last she opened the door. She lit the candles on the chimney piece and on the dressing table, then went to the bed. Edward was lying on his back, with a handkerchief bound round his jaw to hold it up, his hands crossed in front. Bertha stood in front of the corpse and looked. The impression of the young man passed away, and she saw him as in truth he was, stout, red-faced, with the venules of his cheeks standing out distinctly in a purple network. The sides of his face were prominent, as of late years they had become. He had little side whiskers. His skin was lined already and rough. The hair over the front of his head was scanty, and the scalp was visible, shiny and white. The hands, which once had delighted her by their strength, so that she compared them with the porphyry hands of an unfinished statue, now were repellent in their coarseness. For a long time their touch had a little disgusted her. This was the image Bertha wished to impress upon her mind. It was a stranger lying dead before her, a man to whom she was indifferent. At last, turning away, she went out and returned to her own room. 3 days later was the funeral. All the morning wreaths and crosses of beautiful flowers had poured in, and now there was a crowd in the drive in front of Court Leys. The Blackstable Freemasons, lodge number 31,899, of which Edward at his death was worshipful master, had signified their intention of attending, and lined the road 2 and 2 in white gloves and aprons. There were likewise representatives of the Tercanbury Lodge, 4169, of the Provincial Grand Lodge, the Mark Masons, and the Knights Templars. The Blackstable Unionist Association sent 100 conservatives, who walked 2 and 2 after the Freemasons. There were a few words as to precedence between Brother G.W. Hancock, P.W.M., who led the Blackstable Lodge, 31,899, and Mr. Athill Backett, who marched at the head of the politicians. But it was finally settled in favor of the lodge as the older established body. Then came the members of the local district council, of which Edward had been chairman, and after these the carriages of the gentry. Mrs. Mayston Ryle sent a landau and pair, but Mrs. Branderton, the Molsons, and the rest only sent broughams. It needed a prodigious amount of generalship to marshal these forces, and Arthur Branderton lost his temper because the Conservatives would start before they were wanted to. "Ah," said Brother A.W. Rogers, the landlord of the Pig and Whistle, "they want Craddock here now. He was the best organizer I've ever seen. He'd have got the procession into working order and the funeral over by this time." The last carriage disappeared, and Bertha, alone at length, lay down by the window on the sofa. She was devoutly grateful to the old convention which prevented the widow's attendance at the funeral. She looked with tired and listless eyes at the long avenue of elm trees, bare of leaf. The sky was gray and the clouds heavy and low. Bertha now was a pale woman of 30, still beautiful, with curling, abundant hair, but her dark eyes had under them still darker lines, and their fire was half gone. Between her brows was a little vertical line, and her lips had lost the joyousness of youth. The corners of her mouth turned down with a melancholy expression. The face was thin and extremely pale. But what chiefly struck one was that she seemed so utterly weary. Her features remained singularly immobile, and there was in her eyes an apathy that was very painful. Her eyes said that she had loved and found love wanting, that she had been a mother and that her child had died, and that now she desired nothing very strongly but to be left in peace. Bertha was indeed tired out in body and mind, tired of love and hate, tired with friendship and knowledge, tired with the passing years. Her thought wandered to the future, and she decided to leave Blackstable and let Court Leys, so that in no moment of weakness might she be tempted to return. And first she intended to travel, wishing to live in places where she was unknown, so as more easily to forget the past. Bertha's memory brought back Italy, the land of those who suffer in unfulfilled desire, the Lotus Land. She would go there, and she would go farther, ever towards the sun. For now she had no ties on earth, and at last she was free. The melancholy day closed in the great clouds hanging overhead, darkened with approaching night. Bertha remembered how ready in her girlhood she had been to pour herself out to the world. Feeling intense fellowship with all human beings, she wished to throw herself into their arms, thinking that they would be outstretched to receive her. Her life seemed to overflow into the lives of others, becoming one with theirs as the water of rivers becomes one with the sea. But very soon the power she had felt of doing all this departed. She recognized a barrier between herself and humankind, and felt that they were strangers. Hardly understanding the impossibility of what she desired, she placed all her love, all her faculty of expansion, on one person, on Edward, making a final effort, as it were, to break the barrier of consciousness and unite her soul with his. She drew him towards her with all her might, Edward the man, seeking to know him in the depths of his heart, yearning to lose herself in him. But at last she saw that what she had striven for was unattainable. I myself stand on one side and the rest of the world on the other. There is an abyss between that no power can cross, a strange barrier more insuperable than a mountain of fire. Not even the most devoted lovers know the essentials of one another's selves. However ardent their passion, however intimate their union, they are always strangers, scarcely more to one another than chance acquaintance. And when she discovered this, with many tears and after bitter heartache, Bertha retired into herself. But soon she found solace. In her silence she built a world of her own, and kept it from the eyes of every living soul, knowing that none could understand it. And then all ties were irksome, all earthly attachments unnecessary. Confusedly thinking these things, Bertha's thoughts reverted to Edward. If I had been keeping a diary of my emotions, I should close it today with the words, "My husband has broken his neck." But she was pained at her own callousness. "Poor fellow," she murmured. "He was honest and kind and forbearing. He did all he could, and tried always to act like a gentleman. He was very useful in the world, and in his own way he was fond of me. His only fault was that I loved him and ceased to love him." By her side lay a book she had read while waiting for Edward when he was hunting. Bertha had put it on the table open, face downwards, when she rose from the sofa to receive the expected visitor, and it had remained as she left it. She was tired of thinking, and taking it now, began to read quietly. End of Chapter